Great. So yeah, so I'll kick off by speaking more specifically about the research that I've been doing, and I'm hoping to really develop here. So this is, in a way, I've been kind of doing this for about maybe 3 years or so, and obviously it's drawn on work that I was doing before then, but it's marking, I suppose, where I've really started to think that I am actually working specifically in futures rather than wandered in because I was interested in the interdisciplinary ride. So what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about the futures side of this, a little bit about the literary side of it, and then where I'm hoping to take it next. And it's absolutely work in progress, that I've got a sort of a germ of an idea, which I suppose I could sum up by saying we all probably would agree that literature is a great way of thinking about different worlds and different ways of being. It presents in terms of content, but also in terms of the actual kind of narrative structures. It gives you ways of thinking that are very different to rather more kind of functional uses of thought processes, or indeed functional uses of language, so that literature, I think, would be widely acknowledged to be a great way of imagining alternative ways of being and doing. But it doesn't routinely get applied to futures thinking. And so futures is, you know, in its starting position, it's about planning in quite a functional kind of way. Futures thinking has an economic aspect, a sort of an urban planning aspect, a military aspect, as you know, those sorts of sectors try to imagine what might be to come and how they might deal with it. And there's a whole load of sort of set of techniques that have been developed, not particularly in academia, much more so out in the wider, in those sectors, I guess. But my interest is in bringing the two together. So that's what I'm going to be talking about now. So first of all, I thought I would give you a really quick run through on what futures means. I presume no particular knowledge of futures thinking. It's not in some ways that difficult. And some of it is quite intuitive, but when you start to think of it as if you think of it as futures studies as a discipline, it is really interesting in what it's trying to do and how it sets about trying to do it. So how do we know about the future? What is futures thinking, if you're doing a quick summation? But very broadly speaking then, there are forecasting techniques ranging from divination and all sorts of well-known cultural practices, astrology and the like. Sort of we can think of various religious cultural practices going back thousands of years. And there are also the more scientific end of forecasting, so weather forecasting. My dad happens to be a meteorologist, so that one always resonates with me. And you know, any form of economic forecasting which will draw on trends that you can analyze and sort of project onwards into the future on the basis of the data that you know and can observe around you. There's also backcasting, which is the thing that particularly interests me and has come about. I mentioned urban planning before, that it's particularly there that backcasting started to take hold, I think kind of in the 1990s, whereby the idea was you try and think ahead to what you want and then go backwards from that. And what would you need to do in order to get to that point? A little bit like writing a college strategy, I might add. So there are two sort of basic sets of different ways of trying to get yourself to the future. One is work with what you know and get to it from that. And the other is work kind of backwards from where you want to be and see how you might get there, to model different versions of the world. Scientific modeling, referred to in a book by Barbara Adam and Chris Groves called Future Matters, which is my primer if you're interested in futures thinking in general. They talk about mechanistic science, and they do then give lots of disclaimers that science isn't actually that straightforward, and there are differentiated models. But there is a mechanistic use made of science which tends to lose the detail and differentiation, and tends to end up being rather extrapolative and linear, and have a sort of a rather simplistic cause and effect. So that kind of mechanistic use that's made of scientific research can tend to be rather linear in the way it folds out, and in that sense lock you into a certain way of thinking. So here's why I'm interested in literature and creative practice. As I said at the outset, artworks do offer an alternative knowledge system. The whole question of time is interesting, because there's this kind of encapsulated thing that a novel is written but can resonate in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of different cultural contexts, and right through over in some instances hundreds of years. So the question of where the future is, and are we talking about linear time or just some kind of alternative space that is encapsulated in literature, I think gives us some interesting questions back on what do we mean by futures anyway. So art has a fundamentally different relationship to time, perhaps, than some of this mechanistic modeling that I'm referencing above there. So for me, creative futures, and that's what some of the work I was doing over the last couple of years, is really exploring how can we bring this kind of interesting mixture of the creative, the artistic, and the other attempts to model the future together, and reach a different set of stakeholders to the ones that, as a literary scholar, I would routinely have been talking to, which is, let's be honest, other literary scholars. But the interest for me in doing this work is precisely to go significantly beyond that. So very quickly, I'm not even, this is more a meta talk on a slide than actually telling you what's on the slide. That if the previous one was about futures and what that is, this one is about the literary side of things. So how does literature do a form of futures thinking, I guess, is the question that I could then give an academic paper on. But I'll give the bullet points of what an academic paper on that might look like. And Don Quixote has become my go-to example for, and it's useful because Don Quixote is in many ways the founder of the modern novel. I think the fact that I can basically, and I have written about this in a published piece if anyone's interested, I like to link Don Quixote to the idea of backcasting, that Don Quixote is a character who has read a whole load of romance novels and wants, in a way, to live in a world where those romance novels are real. So that's the thing he's backcasting from. And then he sets about trying to make the world fit that and behave in the right way in order to become, the errant knight of his readings. So we have here a set of protagonists who actively backcast himself from an alternative normal, which in the process brings about a whole new way of seeing, and that's what causes the humor in the text, because there's a clash between reality as we think it is and the reality that he inhabits. But actually also he along the way he meets other people who also have curious stories and ways of seeing. So the novel sort of becomes this stage for thinking about alternative visions on the world. And the importance, as I put at the bottom, of lived and felt experience in creating attitudes towards our future. Because as you read, you're empathizing or not. Maybe you're standing back and laughing, but it's certainly drawing you into understanding how it might feel to inhabit an alternative version of the world. The second point to be made about Don Quixote is that when you're actually talking about how does literature kind of get out there into the wider world, and how does any sort of understandings that might be going on in the text and that we can tease out as literary scholars, so what, how does that actually play out in real life? Well, Don Quixote is quite a good example of that as well, because it was written in two parts. And the first part, it came out in 1604 or 5, was hugely successful. And everybody wanted to know what would happen next, but Cervantes was a bit slow in finishing the sequel. And in the meantime, somebody else wrote a false sequel, as it were, and everybody started reading that. Cervantes was pretty horrified, and that gave him the impetus to actually finish part 2, which came out in 1614. And in part 2, he has his character Cervantes confronted with what he calls the false sequel, the sort of the false end of his story, and he sets about changing it. So this is an instance of meta fiction, I guess, such as modern novels do all the time, where they get ahead of themselves and start engaging with their own reception. But this was actually brought about by a real reception that then Cervantes kind of wanted to undercut or come away from. So you can imagine how, if one were writing this out as an essay, there would be lots of interesting things to say about that. And it just underscores, I suppose, that Don Quixote is a really good example of thinking about how do you deal with uncertainty, how do you deal with trying to bring about certain outcomes, and how can you express how it feels to be confronted with these things, and to try and set yourself up as somebody who needs to have certain elements of resilience and wants to have agency in their own story. So those are examples, to my mind, of how literature gives great insight into a lot of work that futurists have to do as they're trying to think, how can we think about uncertainty? How can we get people to care about the future? What will it feel like if people are exerting agency? So moving swiftly along then, the second part of literary futures is therefore actually doing stuff with people. So the first couple of slides there were, I can do all that on my own. I can sit and read the books and think about them and come up with the theories of what literature does and what kind of space it opens up and how we philosophize about time. I don't actually need to talk to anybody very much about that. And I suppose that's my frustration over the in recent times, has been thinking, well, how do you get out and do something that inspires other people? And it's also been the thing that's really kind of, I guess, made me excited to do more research, which is much more on the collaborative end. Because what I started doing was actually running groups where we used literary techniques to, and creative techniques more broadly, to start thinking about, well, what are the questions that we're asking about the future? And I started out with a cross-section of researchers from across the university. And more recently, I've been doing it in more of a sort of a contract way, where I've been asked by government organizations to go in and do some kind of creative future style workshop with them, where I've used creative practice, which is specifically draws on narrative techniques, so narrative futures, that's called, to get people who wouldn't ordinarily necessarily have anything much to do with literature, but to get them thinking differently, and get them actually sort of thinking, so what kind of character could I be? How might that character act? So broadly speaking, a form of creative writing, but not in order to produce a piece of creative writing, rather in order to get people to engage with futures in a different way to the way you would do if you're just kind of extrapolating from what you know. And I guess that's the key point, that the techniques I've been developing have been about encouraging people to make that kind of leap of imagination into a world that doesn't feel like the one they think is lying in the future, but rather one that might be curious to explore in other ways. And I'm going to stop talking because we're supposed to be short with a final slide, just to give a sense then of where I have been going with this. I've got a sort of a little research package that's been taken up by primarily by the Ministry of Defence in the UK and the Department of Defence in the US, but I've also engaged with the School of International Futures, who've sort of seen the methods being developed, and the Department for Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, that's in the UK, where we were designing projects where they were really interested in the idea of getting kind of policymakers involved in storytelling on the back of thinking about what literature does. So the format in each case is there's some kind of bite-sized lecture along the lines of what I just gave you, a little bit longer than that, but where I sort of say, on the one hand, this is broadly, how you can start to think about having agency in a story and how it can open up worlds and so on and so forth. And then the second part is then they try out building their own characters, and that can be then adapted to a particular situation that might be relevant to their work. And here's some of the feedback that we've had, which has been really emphasizing that it's not unknown to people, because at some level it is creative writing and people kind of know what that is. And it's kind of future scenario planning. If people are in that space, that urban planners or whatever know well about, and the Ministry of Defence know perfectly well about scenario writing and planning. But it's different because it's got that kind of creative, something slightly quirky about it. So the first piece of feedback from my colleague in the School of International Futures, who does this work all the time in terms of going out and providing futures advice to people, says, well, this helps them get somewhere very different much more quickly than if we had been going through the usual forecasting techniques. The second quote is from the US Department of Defense, who we ran a workshop for them second time about a month ago, and they said, feedback from a year before, they said the characters that our students made kept really lived on, and they kept referring to them in class, and that was just amazing feedback for us, that it had been so meaningful, and had actually influenced their classes going on from that. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts in due course.